Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this fourth conference, which Interni has organized along with Italcementi. We have the honor of having with us Daniel Libeskind, who, of course, doesn't need any introduction. So let me just introduce a master who is known worldwide. From Poland, he survived the Nazi concentration camps. He goes to Israel with his family and then to the US. Musician, he then graduates in architecture in New York and establishes the studio Daniel Libeskind, now operating throughout the world. His projects are everywhere in the world. The Jewish Museum in Berlin, and then many other museums in other cities of the world. Museums alongside urban architecture and neighborhoods often, which are more than just settlements. They are metaphors of cities. Keppel Bay, for instance, in Singapore, and in Udong Hyundai Park in South Korea, like small cities. And then Italian projects, City Life, with one of the 3 towers, and then residential complexes and the museum in Alexandria. In Alessandria, the Palazzo dell'Edilizia, which symbolically is seen as a gate to the city, and then in Padua another Scala, and then Memorie Luci, and then of course Ground Zero, and different scales that Daniel Libeskind approaches with the same intensity and the spirit of research. And from the city it goes to design without the modernist slogan from the spoon to the city, but rather by extending a method which leads to design research which involves museum spaces, indoors, interiors and exteriors. And in Milan, Daniel is now presenting a masterpiece with Zoe Moroni and Trumtrol have produced. It is like a volume stalactite, which is very interesting. Libeskind says, with regard to his projects, he says, I listen around me, I see the faces, and I try to establish bridges towards the future. I'm inspired by light, sound, invisible spirits, and by the knowledge of the place and the location and the tradition, and by the novelty and the innovation. Daniel is also a musician, so the counterpoint is one element to understand his works, and his inspiration. In music, the contrappunto is an element which is inside a composition or in a part of a composition. A set of melodic lines that interact according to the Western tradition, and this is translated by Daniel Libeskind in his architecture. So Counterpoint by Daniel Libeskind.
Grazie. Thank you so much. This is on, yes? Thank you very much. It's a beautiful. Thank you for this beautiful introduction. First of all, I want to thank italcementi and Interni for this great opportunity to be in this wonderful, really palace of concrete. It was designed by my teacher. I was a student many, many decades ago of Richard Meyer. And this is a beautiful facility which shows the importance of material. It shows how a material can be used not just sustainably, but in an aesthetic and architectural way. So it's a really wonderful being here. And also I want to say my appreciation for speaking about Counterpoint, because as a musician, of course, Counterpoint is a key to music. But if you really think about it a little bit more, Counterpoint is really life. There would be no life without Counterpoint. And everything in life, every movement, every thought, every spiritual desire is based on a contrapuntal movement. So in a way, it's a metaphysical or a philosophic definition of what I believe is a language. And architecture, to me, is really a language. Now, it's certainly not just a language of words, although we need a language to communicate building, but architecture itself is a storytelling device. And of course, it uses materials, it uses concrete and steel and glass, but ultimately, architecture to me is a story of many things, of the past, which we are always on the verge of losing, and also on the possibilities which the language of architecture opens to thinking people. So it is a language really of human beings that communicates across languages. You know, unfortunately the world is divided by religions, by ethnic facts, by languages. But I think one thing that unifies the world is the world itself, and of course the world of building is the world through which we see life. And I think that's really something very profound, that architecture is not just an abstract object, not even an object at all, but a language which allows us to see each other, to understand the past, and to move forwards to the future. And I think that's really, to me, the most inspiring part about being involved in architecture. Now, I have put a few words on paper, so to speak, that I'm interested in. It's words that appear to me as important to my own understanding of what I do. And one of those words is hand. You know, we have many instruments in the world today. Technology is developing very rapidly and is helping us to cope with the world. But to me, the hand is a very important organism. It's not just a digit. It's not just the digital world that can point to things and can do things with a digit, but the hand itself, which can grasp and really create an architecture that is, despite all of its technical facility, something that derives from drawing. And, you know, for many, many years, I didn't build anything. You know, I think my first building I built, well, you know, when I was not very young. Really, I didn't build a building for many, many years. But I drew, and I always thought that drawing is the source of architecture. And I don't think it's a new thought. My favorite artists, my favorite architects in the world have also confirmed that out of drawings comes life. Michelangelo, the greatest maybe of all artists, when asked by his nephew, Antonio, what he should do to become an artist, he said, don't do anything, but only draw. So to draw is to really have a connection with the hand, and through the hand, which is of course not just in the hand itself, but the hand of the eye, the hand of the mind, we can communicate in ways that really generate the idea of the sky, that generate the idea of land, that generate new discourses. And of course, that's something that I think is very important not to lose as we become more facile and more able to use synthetic and prosthetic devices to create further and further abstractions. So the hand keeps us, I would say, really rooted in the counterpoint of life. Now, emotion, and the word emotional is not usually associated with architecture. You know, it can be associated with theater, even with music, with cinema, with the consequences of a crisis on the stock market, but the word emotional seems not to be part of architecture. But to me, it's a key word. I think architecture which is without emotion is just a machine. And I think I believe firmly that you need both the idea and the emotion to create a work of architecture as an artwork. And of course, this is something that is also inherent to me in space, that architecture can embody emotions, can move not just the mind, not just the eye, but the heart and the soul. And I think this is really the spiritual aspect of architecture. Of course, there's the spiritual aspect to mathematics, there's the spiritual aspect to the sciences, but in the emotional aspect of how a building can communicate to us something which we cannot put into words, I think that's important. Something that can be built, which cannot be verbalized, which cannot even be articulated, but has a response in the deeper emotions of the human being. And I think that's really part of constructing spaces, constructing buildings or even cities that work on a, let's say, more holistic level. Don't just appeal as a dimension to a part of our being, but encompass the emotional world. And what would music be? What would life be without emotion? You know, if you listen to music only in its mathematical abstract sense, you would not have any emotion. But that's the nature of music, that it is about emotion. Without it, it would not be music. A good piece of literature is the fact that it brings on emotion. So I have always rejected the idea that architecture is a cool art, it's a machine art, it allows us to kind of neutralize the emotions. That's not, to me, architecture. Architecture is deeply, deeply emotional, and I think the buildings that I love have this aspect. Even very ancient buildings which one can hardly understand because of their social sources are so distant from us, we can see that there is an emotion in the pyramids. There is emotion in the temples. There is emotion in the way the earth has been plowed. There's an emotion in the sky, in the mountains. There's emotion in rain. There's emotion. And I think this is a difficult aspect to articulate because the language of architecture has hardly developed a discourse on emotion and form, for example, but I believe in it. As I believe in music, because music, not only because I was a professional musician at one point, but I believe that architecture is completely musical, that it is about, of course, light, proportions, it's about materials, it's about relationships, and that is a wholly emotional project. Now, this happens to be a picture of a concert hall or a performing arts center, but really it is about the fact that human orientation, the fact that human disposition in the world is not based on the eye. We know that the sense of balance is based on the inner ear. And by the way, we see today the rise of performing arts spaces. There was maybe an era in the last 20 years where museums were built all around the world. Now we see performing arts centers, theaters, music halls built, and I think that's part of the rediscovery of the importance of people coming together to listen to music. And music, of course, is, I think, one of the greatest communicators, because language itself is a musical phenomenon, and language of architecture, I believe, is also deeply musical. Now, of course, the word space is, one of the key words in architecture, but what can it mean when it comes to very, very large constructions? Space which is intimate, a space of the home, a space of a block of city, a neighborhood, we can understand. But what does space mean when, let's say, we are creating a city for millions of people to live in? How do we create a space that is truly a humanistic space? Now, as a master planner of one of the largest projects in the world, which has maybe 30 skyscrapers, 30 of some of the biggest skyscrapers, I sought to understand that space is not just the grid. It's not just the abstract space that you can see only when you see large buildings, but how to organize a series of events that break space into a human scale. And I think that's very important, that space is not the Newtonian space. It's not even the sort of the modernist space, but the space that somebody like Albert Einstein understood as being relative to time, that is warped by our participation in history. And I think that's something interesting, that the space is not this endless grid of the 17th or 18th century, but the space is topological because it is moved by our own relationship to it. And of course, in a city, that's probably a very, very key element of creation. Memory is another word that I often think about because it's not an extra. Sometimes we think of memory when we go to a cemetery. We think of memory when we see an old building or somebody who has passed away or even somebody who's very old. But actually memory is the youngest of all the faculties of the human being, because without memory we would not be able to know who we are. Without memory we would have no yesterday or tomorrow. It's the greatest piece of orientation that there is. So memory is not a footnote to architecture, but the idea of building in memorability is itself part of what I believe is sustainability. And of course, this is a talk also about sustainability, but I often think that sustainability is, of course, the use of great materials, the logic of preserving nature, the logic of interacting in a way which is sustainable and in economic sense as well. But ultimately, it is the logic of memorability, of being able to be oriented to something that is worthwhile. And even in large projects, urban projects, where one has to organize a park, a civic space, which is of the key importance, the buildings themselves that contribute to such a project have to create a memorable aspect, a memorable relationship. And that goes, of course, in terms of every living space. Every person living in a very small apartment or whatever apartment has to have a memorable relationship to the environment. And of course, culture itself is really, I would say, the art of memory. The art of memory, which was very famous in Italy back in the 16th century, with people like Giordano Bruno, Campanella, the great thinkers about the world, remains to me one of the great arts of architecture. And it's not just an art that we have to sort of learn from, but an art which we have to practice, because in architecture, what is memorable is often difficult to achieve in the society. So communicative perhaps is another important word, since buildings actually communicate by their activities. You know, this happens to be a university building, but a building, even though it is, you can say, a container, like a big cube made out of concrete in this case, it has to be able to communicate internally through its structure, where you bring a lot of different people and create a communicative network of spaces and temperatures and atmospheres that create an energy that can be harnessed in terms of education, in terms of learning, in terms of life itself. And of course, that's something that I believe every building really possesses, but to articulate it in ways which are new, because it is easy in architecture to follow a kind of illusory order, as if the world was ordered in a certain way, but the order of the world depends actually on us. And the order can be changed, not by dictators, not by great politicians, but by us, by the art of architecture. And that's also what I wanted to say, that, you know, politicians are often proven wrong. Critics are also disproven in time. The only thing which never fails is art, because art is itself, and architecture, a defiance of failure. So, yeah, you know, politicians, governments, businessmen can go bankrupt, but the art of architecture can really never fail, because it is defying failure by its existence. And so it is something radical. And radical doesn't mean just politically naive. It's something which is rooted in a place. Now, I happen to have been born in Poland and witnessed this city which was so oppressed by communism, by Stalin. And so being able to bring back something rooted in the city of Warsaw. This happens to be a residential tower, which is one of the largest in Europe. but to bring something of a free flight of the imagination, rooted in a very large building, and the building is also torqued. It takes advantage of where its space, where it is. So it's cantilevered. It's formed to take advantage of its views, and without competing with the Palace of Culture, because it's the tallest building, to create a new central space in Warsaw that brings back life to the center of the city rather than just the symbolic buildings of oppressive tyrants. And I think that's important, to change, to be able to create a democratic city, a city that is interesting, that isn't based just on monuments, but on people's everyday life. I also believe that architecture should be pointed. That doesn't mean that it has to be sharp physically, but it has to have a point to it. Now, a building in a place like Las Vegas, a first sustainable building in the desert, which means it's a shopping center, a part of a large project, but also a project that brings daylight, that brings light, that breaks the rules of what is the point of building? The point of building is to create an urban experience, a civic experience, also a functional experience that brings something to the city that it didn't have before. And by the way, sustainability here is very important, because usually in the desert, Nevada, buildings are hermetically sealed and air conditioned. But to create a building that is LEED platinum here, that takes advantage of the energy, that enforces a new idea that the streets are really important, or rather the interiors of hotels, is part of the development of a building that has these characteristics. And I think I always ask myself with this word, what is the point of building? Is there a point to it? Is there a meaning to it? And I think if there is, that question is asked, then one realizes, and I realize that every building should have a point to it. Now, complex is a word which is often shunned by architects. Everybody always talks about the simple. Give us the simple solution. Simplicity is the best. Minimum is the best. Make it simple. Stupid. But the world is complex. The brain is complex. The DNA is complex. Everything is complex. The astrophysics, God, divinity, the world that we don't see is complex. And so I really believe that buildings should mirror complexity. They should not try to dumb down architecture. And the dumbing down of architecture is very common, because it's easy to say, let's go back to the simple. But we can't go back. You can never go back home again. And in this case, you see an old building. Well, in America, it's old. In Europe, it will be young. It's a 19th century building. But creating an interaction, a complexity of using old structure and new structure, being able to create a new sense of the reading of the city, a complex new relationship of functions. I think that's part of illuminating the complexity of a city. And of course, that's something that has to do with both tradition and the new. How do you combine? How do you navigate between different eras in a way that doesn't reduce time to a formula, but gives time a chance to live out its spirit? And of course, that's something complex. It is also something political. And that's another word which architects don't really like. Because, what is politics in architecture? But I would say, in my experience, everything is about politics. Because that's what the politeia means. The Greek word means it's the city. That's the politics, the city. And that's the democracy. And let's not fool ourselves. We know that in the Greek times, one of my favorite philosophers, probably yours too, Plato, said of a small city, when he was in Athens, he said, unfortunately, no matter how small a city is, there are the poor people and the rich people, and we have politics to try to resolve problems. So, rich and poor, the divide, the gap that we see today is nothing new. It existed thousands of years ago, and it's deeply political. And, building a piece of architecture is deeply political, because architecture has taken a position. It cannot just pretend that you can just put another flag on top of it and everything is fine. So, of course, when building a building that has to do with the drama of destruction, of war, of the terror of war in Germany, one has to really take a position that this is not just another museum, that this is a museum that should speak about the catastrophe of conflict, catastrophe of war. And of course, this building is pointing to the devastation of Dresden, which was bombed. And as from Dresden were bombed many other cities. But it is also a building that brings back this political dimension that conflict, war, is deeply part of the civic space. And we have to understand, why is there war? Why do people participate in conflicts? Why do they involve themselves? Do they know about it? Do they think about it? And to make such a building, and I think every building has this. Of course, a residential building seems to be less political, but it does have to do with the city, with other people. So it has to interact, I think, in this sense, and take a position, not just as something oblivious and distant, but take a position. What is this politics about? And I also think that the word sculpture is usually a dismissal of architecture. When somebody says, "Oh, that's a sculpture," it means the building is kind of okay. Forget it. That's not a real building. It's a sculpture. But one of my favorite artists of the 20th century, Marcel Duchamp, the French artist, said that all of architecture is a sculpture, but it has plumbing inside of it. So it's sculpture with plumbing. If you took this plumbing out of it, it would be a pure sculpture. And I think this is true also for Renaissance artists, for Baroque artists, for the great artists of Italy, Borromini, Bernini, Michelangelo. They always thought that it is a sculpture. And the way architecture and critics, politicians usually dismissed architecture, even back in the 15th century, it was to say it's a sculpture. But it is, because it has to create a spatial interaction with the sky, with the earth, with seasons, and even in very large historical city, I think even with the commercial world, the world of retail, the world of offices, one can create new kind of sculpture where the emphasis is on cutting through the green, bringing sort of the greenery, and creating a relationship even within very tight laws of what a building is, where it has to stand, what shape it has to have. I really think that's an important aspect, even of a very, very large mega project as this one is in construction. Another point that I think is very important is the unexpected. Again, sorry, this is a Greek reference. Heraclitus said, you have to expect the unexpected, otherwise you will miss it. I mean, just think about it. If you don't expect the unexpected, it happens, but you didn't see it. So the unexpected, I think, is very, very important in architecture. And sometimes, of course, the unexpected seems to be a collision or seems to be in conflict with the existing, but that's only momentary. Because I think buildings, of course, when they are first built, like any piece of literature or piece of music which is first played, is going to be unexpected and maybe not even accepted. Let's not forget that when Beethoven's Eroica Symphony, Symphony No. 3 by Beethoven, was first performed, there was a very negative reaction by the public and the critics. They said it was too long. It had too many, the same notes repeated. They thought it was a really bad piece of music. Now, they were wrong, because we listened to Beethoven's Third Symphony. It's one of the great symphonies of Beethoven. So again, the idea of a place, what it means, how it's organized, I think that's part of expecting the unexpected. And I think the cities of the future, certainly we have to expect the unexpected, because technology is giving us possibilities of interacting with city in ways that will certainly disrupt and reform how we read the organization, the logic, and the social life of a city. Another word I often think about is the word raw. Things are very sophisticated, but I like the raw. Some people don't like raw fish. I actually like it. Things which are not cooked can also be good. So cooking, of course, I admire and I love eating, but the raw it means kind of a deliberate exposure of architecture, a kind of nakedness, that it is not really pretty, It's not a matter of taste, but the rawness in terms of its immediate effect, I think, is important in architecture. And sometimes it's also economically sustainable, because buildings then become very, very empty of infrastructure, very empty of systems. They become really just kind of the spaces of rawness. And I believe in the raw, especially as the world is becoming more and more sophisticated with skins, with many layers of sophisticated covering. I think the raw, I'm interested in what remains raw underneath all the covers, underneath all the clothing, what remains completely unhidden, even if you try to hide it. And I think what remains unhidden is the story that the building tells, because that's part of its mission. Innovation, of course, that's a word we all know and respect and love as architects. But I think, what does it really mean to be innovative? Is of course being able to use the technical capacities to construct something which has not been constructed before. And that's my view, by the way, that I don't like doing something that was already done, because it was already done. The challenge is not there anymore. So let's say if you create a project for a residential set of towers and buildings on a very, very small piece of land with extreme high density. It's extreme high density in Singapore. You have to put a lot of people living together in a very, very small piece of land, which is sustainable. How do you create something that gives the individuality to every person who's living there? How do you bring individuality in a global world? I think this is part of the challenge today. We live more and more in a homogeneous world, a more global world. But that means that we have to provide more individuality to each, because we don't want to become just a number in a great world system. So creating, putting greenery, putting parks really up high on the bridges, in the towers, creating social and cultural facilities in a very, very tight site, I think it's very urbane, and of course creates a totally different look to the city, because each individual in this doubly curved building really lives not in an extrusion, but in a separate space, kind of a floating space, I would say. And if one is in those apartments, you can see that it's slightly strange. It's kind of like being more in space than just being in a large block. And of course, that's part of also contributing something to the urban sense, that there is nature, that buildings are part of an organic world of nature. And even if they are not curved, they are related to something deeper than appears in the surface of the materials, but is part of the material itself. Of course, diversity is, to me, one of the key words, because the world is diverse, and I think architects should cultivate diversity. I'm against one style. I'm against the fact that the city should look in the same way all the time. I think it has diverse people from different places, different villages, different countries, different languages. So even in a high traffic environment over a highway, important one in Europe, you can create a diversity even as an environment that is, let's say, commercial, that is residential. This project has also housing for the elderly. But my idea here of diversity is to change the idea. If you make a commercial project, treat it like a cultural project. Don't treat it like a shopping center or just a swimming pool. Treat it like a temple of the water, and shift the program so that it suddenly appears to be done in a different register. And I think that may be the future also, that buildings suddenly acquire a totally different character because one thinks of them differently. One doesn't just think of them in the same way, but thinks of them diversely, applying their space. Risk. That's a word that architects don't like, clients don't like. Nobody likes the word risk. Not on Wall Street, not anywhere. But I think it's a very important word, because without a risk, you cannot do anything. You cannot even take the next breath without a risk. Everything is risky in life. And I believe that architecture has to take risks. Great cities, I mean, these great cities in Italy or Europe or Asia, wherever we are now, have taken risks to become city. It's not easy to become a great metropolis. It takes risks, it takes conflict, but I really believe that a building too should take a risk and do things that really sort of are not safe. no, I don't mean technically safe, because this cantilever, even though it's the longest one ever built, is very safe. But the risk, to change the idea of art, the art is not just in a box, but art is sort of flying beyond the silhouette of the city itself. That there is a myriad of perspectives on art. It's not just the linear process of repeating old formation of art, and that the building can, as a civic building, bring back through a city, take a risk. And I took a risk here in the center of the downtown, which had many parking garages. It was kind of depopulated. Everybody moved, liked to be in the suburbs and the nice houses. I said, no, this could be the great thing for the city, create a building and a residential quarter and a piazza that brings people back to the center of the city. And I'm happy to say that indeed is what happened. This Golden Dome Capitol building used to be sort of by itself there. And suddenly there is a movement back to the center of the city, which I think is sustainability itself. We don't want to drive cars, spend money and oil and gasoline to commute. We want to be where other creative people are. And I think that's really sustainability in itself, that you want to be with other creative people because that's where you learn something. You can find out something you didn't know before. And bringing people together, I think, is part of the risk. Developing a neighborhood that may initially not be popular, with a building which may look very radical, and so on and so on. Okay, human, of course, I think we don't really know what that word fully means, but we have to remember what Freud, that great thinker, said. He said that civilization was created. Civilization, the reason for the existence of civilization is to protect us from nature. To think about that. That the civilization was created to protect us from nature. And that is what is human. Now, what does that mean, protect us from nature? If you do a large skyscraper in New York, how can you bring nature in a way that is positive? Of course, you have to sort of carve the building in a different way. Of course, the building has to be an economic building. It's a high-rise. It has to be built, in a strong way. But to bring an emphatically new economy of living, to bring trees high up into the skyline of New York, that is, of course, part of creating a perforated building that, of course, has to work economically, has to be just like any other residential building, because New York is a pretty conservative city in terms of building. And at the same time, I think has to create something that has a connection to people in a deeper way and of course, identifies itself with nature in a new way. Now, this is my last word, so I'm running out of time, but it's a very important word to me. Democracy, because maybe I grew up under, because I grew up under a totalitarian government. I remember it. I was 13 years old in Poland. I remember the oppression that my parents suffered. I remember the soldiers. I remember the fact that people in Poland couldn't speak freely. They had to whisper all the time. I am a great believer in democracy. It's, as Winston Churchill said, it's the best of all the worst possible system, because every system is bad. But he said it's the best of all those systems, and he's right. It's not a perfect system. But I think it's more important, better, to work in the messiness of democracy than if you're given a nice project by a dictator and you just do a perfect project. And I always say, so what? So what that it's a beautiful project done where people can't speak their minds, are not involved in the discussion about what is to be built. And, I experienced this firsthand as a master planner in New York, because it's a very difficult thing to work in New York with all the different powers. You have the political powers. You've got the politicians. You've got the powers of money, of capital. You've got the investors. You've got the governors. You've got the mayors. You've got the families of the victims. You've got the eye of New Yorkers. But at the same time, I am a believer that democracy, the Statue of Liberty, what it says, give me your poor, the tired people of the world, give me the poor people. That's what democracy is about. And of course, this is something that I struggled over many years. It's a project that isn't happening, maybe in a different country with a different government. It could happen in a couple of years. It will be done, finished. Everything is fine. But at a democracy, you have to gather a consensus. If people have to come to an agreement, even if they have conflicting views, they have to agree on what to do. And of course, the drawing on the left is my early sketch. It was done many, many years ago. The drawing on the perspective on the right is the more recent perspective that people have agreed. It's very close. Of course, you have to compromise in a democracy. Democracy is not perfect, but I think that's what makes it powerful. That's why I think democracy is the future of the world, because it gives people a voice, and the voice sort of vibrates with tensions. It's not a perfect thing, and yet when I see Ground Zero and I see out of my window the fact that the city is coming back to life, people are coming back to Lower Manhattan in many, many thousands to live, not just to visit. I think that's the greatest testament to democracy, because there are now more than twice the people living in Lower Manhattan than were before the attacks of September 11th. So connecting memory of this tragedy, also with the fact that you can use it to create a better neighborhood. You can create a more meaningful relationship with public space. And by the way, that's what democracy is. It's not about private buildings. It's not about nice facades. Of course, it'd be nice to have nice facades too. But democracy is basically about shared public space. And I think in every project where I have been involved, whether it's a commercial project, whether it's a project by a big investment conglomerate, whether it's a civic project of a government, I've always fought for public space, because the public space is what gives people this connection. And that's the skyline of New York, with which I started, which speaks to the fact that, it's a city of differences, a city that is so impressive, and yet a city that at the end is really about the torch, a flame that has to do with the fact that we all want to have freedoms, that our freedoms are not full yet, that we are not completely emancipated, that we have, not all of us have left Egypt. We're supposed to leave Egypt behind, but, slavery is still here in this world. And so I do believe that freedom, democracy, is an incredibly important, maybe the fundamental part of what I believe architecture should be. Thank you so much.
Bene, una conferenza veramente interessante.
This lecture was dense but very, very interesting. Let me summarize. It's difficult to summarize the message of Daniel Libeskind. The urban sense of each project, the idea of building a center, Las Vegas, for instance, the Las Vegas project, the city center is the heart now of that city, and it sets the idea of a city center. Thinking of architecture symbolically, we heard about emotions, and emotions become part of the material of a project. The value of public space, in which the concept of democracy becomes a guiding value, as Daniel said, and it also means highlighting value and the humanistic aspect of architecture. Thank you very much, Daniel. So let's conclude. We're concluding today this cycle of lectures that Interni has organized in cooperation with Italcementi. We hope that we shall repropose this very interesting experience. And this morning we were discussing about producing a DVD with these lectures, a useful tool for all those people who are professionals and non-professionals of architecture. If you wish to visit this building now, as you exit, there are people outside that will help you and guide you through the building. Thank you very much, and we'll meet you all next year. Thank you very much.